slide. However, we labor market analysts throughout the state help each other out, when we have conflicts or need us to cover. So while we specialize in each of our regions, we do talk a lot about the same issues, and a lot of the same issues are seen in a lot of the different regions throughout the state. So labor market trends that may, happen in Northeast Minnesota are happening in Southeast Minnesota as well. So I'm here today to kind of talk about those greater labor market trends as they are specific to Southeast Minnesota and Winona County. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you all too. So if you have questions of any of the information that I'm presenting, by all means, just raise your hand or pipe in, and I'll try and answer those questions as we go, because I think it's more effective when we do these presentations as more of an interactive method. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll try and see those as well. Or Chris, if you notice that I'm not seeing a question and want to just ask it, by all means, just go ahead. I mentioned us regional analysts. This is kind of how we're dispersed throughout the state. You can see I'm up in Northeast and colleagues throughout the rest of the state. We in the regional analysts analysis and outreach unit are here to be kind of your navigators of labor market information. So we have a ton of data that we offer through Deed, a lot of different tools on our website, but sometimes it can be a little overwhelming to know where to start and what it all means. So we are here as your kind of point of contact to navigate that information and all those tools that are available to all Minnesotans, business owners, job seekers, chambers of commerce, different units of government, pretty much anyone that can use our labor market information to make decisions. So today, I'm going to cover kind of the gamut of what we cover in the labor market information office. Population and labor force are kind of those key foundational aspects. Like as the population moves, so does the labor force typically. We'll look into industries and occupations and cost of living in the region. And then we'll look a little more specifically about what's happened last year in terms of how the pandemic and the pandemic-induced recession have fallen on Southeast Minnesota. So with that, we'll dive right in. So starting with some basic population stats, I find that it's good to get some grounding first. And many of you might be aware of some of these trends in Southeast Minnesota and how they've been changing, but it's also nice to kind of compare with the state as a whole. I'll probably reference Northeast Minnesota a little bit just because, I have a lot of experience up there. But in Northeast Minnesota, we have a huge population. Like we are not growing nearly as fast as the rest of the state. And Winona County actually is faring a little bit better, not growing quite at the pace that the state as a whole is, but closer than we are up in Northeast Minnesota. So from 1950 to 2019, the county's population grew about 26%, about 10,000, a little over 10,000 people. And in the last decade, that population kind of, that growth kind of leveled out, and there was a decline of almost 2%. So we'll touch on some of those components of that population change in the next couple slides. But comparative to Minnesota, their population as a whole for the state grew 90% since 1950 and 6.3% over the last decade. And a lot of that growth is occurring in the metro area. We look at the breakdown of population by age group, and this is really interesting. So if you're shown this chart without any context, you're like, whoa, we got a ton of 15 to 24-year-olds. That is a good sign for the labor market. You've got a lot of up and coming young workers that are about to enter the labor force. But we know that Winona is a college town. So a lot of those 15 and 24-year-olds may be here temporarily, but But that also represents an opportunity, is, capturing some of those folks and getting them to stick around and enter the labor force for the county and the region. That's kind of the goal. A lot of places. I know, again, in Northeast Minnesota, we have colleges as well, UMD, Lake Superior College, St. Scholastica. A lot of people come into town, go to school, and then most of them end up going to the Twin Cities. So capturing more of those graduates is definitely a goal. Higher percentages in some of the 65 and older compared to the state. But for the most part, other than that 15 to 24, generally in line with the breakdown for the rest of the state. But the higher percent of 75 and over could also indicate fewer labor force participants, because as folks get older, especially over 65, labor force participation tends to drop considerably. But how are those groups going to change? We have projections, or how have they changed? Excuse me. In the past about 20 years, we go through 2019 is the latest population estimates that we have. The largest losses have been in those 5 to 14 and 35 to 54. And that's significant because that represents the current, like the meat of the current workforce, the 35 to 54-year-olds. That tends to be where you have the most labor force participation or the highest rates. And then that 5 to 14, of course, the youth. Like anytime you're losing younger people means, for at least for the work, in terms of the workforce, that it's going to be harder to kind of fill those gaps as older workers age out. And you see that aging out or aging up in the huge gains among those 55 to 74. Almost 2,000 are adding. So as people move up from age group to age group, you see that they're corresponding. So that loss in that 35 to 54 corresponds with a gain in the 55 and to 74. And again, in terms of the labor force, that is definitely significant. I mentioned projections, and those large losses of those 35 years and those 45 to 74, you can see that trend is expected to continue. So we have projections from 2020. Obviously, we don't the projections there. Then the 2030 and 2040 projections, that's more relevant now. And from 2020 to 2040, the largest decline we're expecting in that 55 to 64 year old age group, about a third of a decline. And also in 65 to 74. So it's no surprise that we're also projecting to see the largest increases in those 75 and older age groups. And the increase in the 35 to 44, that is positive, because we do want to see growth in that age group, especially as we think about who our workers are going to be in the next 20, 30 years. So I mentioned the labor force, so let's jump into that a little bit. The steady growth statewide, you can see in the light blue in the background, but then we overlay the labor force trend. So what has labor force done the last 20 years in Winona County? You can see that it has a little more variability, and that tends to be the case when you look at smaller areas. The peak of the labor force was almost 30,000 in 2012. And you look at 2004, about 28,000 was kind of the low peak. So you look at the scale on the left, these changes aren't massive, but when you have a smaller kind of pool of workers, when you lose 1,000 here and there, that actually makes quite a big difference. And COVID definitely has had an impact on the labor force. Excuse me. And I'm going to go into that in a little more detail in some subsequent slides. But the labor force is, for me, definitely is the story of COVID and how it changed last year throughout the state. Overall, the labor force has dropped in the last 20 years by about 5% or 0.5%. But at the same time, Minnesota's has grown by about 10%. So that is something to keep in mind as well, kind of differing directions. I mentioned that direction, break it down by decade. How has the labor force changed? And this is for Southeast Minnesota. And you look at the average, excuse me, sorry, this is for Winona County. Average number of workers added or subtracted from the labor force each year. You can see that, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, largely averaging positive gains to the labor force, and then was more of a mixed result between 2000 and 2010. And then now we're starting to average more of the loss of the labor force. And I will say on this slide, this is a common slide in some of the more rural areas of the state, particularly Northeast Minnesota, some in Northwest Minnesota as well, and of course down here in Southeast Minnesota. We also have projections for the labor force. These, again, are tied pretty closely to how that population change was occurring. So large declines in 55 to 64, that also kind of ties with declines in those the populations as well. The declines in that age group are higher than the growth that is projected for all the others combined. So you can kind of see that in the chart there on the right. It's really kind of dominating the narrative, as a lot of the 55 to 64-year-old workers, we're expecting them, at least a good portion of them, to retire and age into the 65 to 74-year-old age group for the labor force. So we're going to see that chunk of the labor force, 65 to 74, increase, but not by any means the same level to kind of replace the losses you see in the 55 to 64-year-old age group. Overall, Winona County's labor force is projected to decrease by about 7%. So that's accelerating the trend that we saw in the last slide by quite a bit. And without younger workers or younger people to kind of replenish that labor force, that is what is basically informing that projection. I love this GIF. So this chart is showing job seekers per vacancy. So this is basically showing, how many people are unemployed in those green bars, and then how does that compare to the level of vacancies in Southeast Minnesota. And starting on the left, you can see that there are about 3.5 job seekers per vacancy as we exited the Great Recession. And in the subsequent 8 years, that consistently fell to the point where we had 0.6 job seekers per vacancy. So that's when we had a really tight labor market, and employers had more trouble finding workers, and that was the case throughout the state. However, 2020 kind of upended that narrative a little bit in some ways, but not in others. We have a lot more unemployed folks, of course. However, the job vacancies did not fall nearly as much as they did after the Great Recession. We don't have 2009, 2010 in this chart, but I can tell you that when the Great Recession happened, the job vacancies fell quite a bit more. So you can see there's a decline from 2019 to 2020 there in the red line, but that decline there is not of the same magnitude that we saw in 2008, 2009. So while we do have more unemployed folks, we also have more vacancies there. So that 2.3 job seekers per vacancy is equivalent to 2012, 2013. But it's not anywhere near the ratio we had in 2008, 2009, 2011. I have a question for you, and maybe you can throw this into the chat if you want, or just shout it out. What do you think the labor force participation rate is for the US, the state of Minnesota, or in Winona County? So the labor force, for your reference, if you're not familiar, is the 16+ population that is either working or looking for work. So the labor force participation rate is that group, the people who are working or looking for work over 16, out of the entire 16 plus non-institutional population, so people who aren't in prison or in the Army, et cetera. Are there any guesses of what people think the labor force participation rate is? Let's see if I can open the chat here.
See the chat, Carson.
I'm trying to open it and struggling.
We've got
Sorry.
one person guessed 87%.
Okay.
One guess is 55. One says, my guess is that Minnesota is above the US, but Winona is below Minnesota.
Wow. Okay. That you guys are you have some informed folks on the call. Yeah. So those like the 80 and then the 50, we're like somewhere in between. So for the US, this is March of 2021. That's 61.5%. And the person who said that Minnesota is above the US, that is correct. We are actually known for having one of the highest labor force participation rates in the country. So 67.8. However, that 67.8 is quite a bit lower than what we typically are at, which is around 70. And then Winona County, we don't have labor force participation rate numbers for 2020 yet. So stay tuned. However, in 2019, this table on the right, we know that the labor force participation rate for Winona County was just under 70%, so 69.6, and barely under the state rate in 2019, which was 69.7. So yeah, great guesses all around. We do typically have higher labor force participation in Minnesota, historically so. But the trend over the last year has meant that has declined. We've seen people exit the labor force. But we have more detailed information, of course, for by demographic, by age group, race, ethnicity in different groups, educational attainment. For 2019, these data are from the census, the ACS, which is the American Community Survey, and that comes out about a year after the fact. So the most recent data we have right now is for 2019. But it's still important to look at because knowing that, for example, 16 to 19-year-olds tend to have lower labor force participation in general and higher unemployment. And you can see that there in the highlighted cells. We also see that people of color tend to have lower labor force participation rates. That is actually not the case in Winona County. In Northeast Minnesota, there's quite a disparity. Almost every group of color has lower labor force participation rates and higher unemployment. But in Winona County, you see there's a couple groups that have higher unemployment rates, but only Black or African American workers have a lower labor force participation rate, and that's only slightly lower. But then when you compare to the state, you can see that for the most part, Winona County has some lower labor force participation rates, some exceptions with indigenous workers and workers of two or more races. But those unemployment rates for those that are highlighted are quite a bit higher in Winona County than they are for the state as a whole. Workers with disabilities have a lower labor force participation rate, higher unemployment, and then those workers with lower educational attainment, you can see that as you gain more education and training, there's a correlation with an increase in labor force participation. And unemployment rates, that's one of the things that we're known for. We publish them monthly along with some jobs numbers. And Winona County, the unemployment rate basically mimics the state. So since 2000, you can see that they almost track exactly together. although it was consistently a bit lower. In 2009, probably no surprise, peak of the Great Recession. That's when we saw the most recent high of 7.7%. And in 2020, the annual average, despite some significant variation throughout the year, was 4.5. So higher than what we've seen the last couple of years, but not an order of magnitude higher than some other places throughout the state. And I will say that currently the unemployment rate in Winona, so the most recent data we have is for February, 3.7 is where Winona County is at right now in terms of unemployment rate. And for Southeast Minnesota is 4.3. And then we just released the March numbers for the state yesterday, and the state is at 4.2% seasonally adjusted. So 4.5 is the one I would compare to. So Southeast Minnesota and Winona County are faring better than the state as a whole most recently. COVID unemployment rates. So this shows you the trend throughout last year in Winona County. You can see in May, that was the kind of the peak of unemployment. Pretty significant jump from March to April. I mean, we talked about how your last in-person meeting was March 13th, and things just changed essentially overnight. And that we don't usually see that in the labor force, where you have such drastic changes from month to month. So it's been a roller coaster, I'm sure, for all of you as well, but just trying to follow the trends has been really challenging as well. The second round of increases kind of towards the end of the year, those corresponded with a lot those new regulations that were imposed and restrictions kind of as the COVID cases spiked at the end of the year. So those kind of coincide with that, but they also coincide with kind of the general seasonal increases in the unemployment rate over the winter. So now I'm going to dive into a little bit of the employment wages and cost of living in Southeast Minnesota and Winona County. There's a lot to look at on this chart here on this slide, but some takeaways. Healthcare practitioners, office administrative support, production, sales related, and food preparation and serving related. Those 5 occupational groups, they make up more than half of the employment in Southeast Minnesota. And that's, perhaps not a surprise. Healthcare, production, mainly manufacturing related jobs. The median wage across all occupations is almost $20 an hour. And many of those higher employing occupational groups have lower starting wages. So they're lower than the overall median for the region. The big exception, of course, being healthcare practitioners and technical, almost double the median wage. So that is good that your largest occupational group in your region is also a very well-paying one. Median wages tend to range from about $12.10 an hour. So that's food preparation and serving. It's a lot of your folks that work in restaurants, to management, which is CEOs, VPs, those sorts of jobs. And many of those higher wage occupations in Southeast Minnesota tend to be in lower employing groups, with the exception of healthcare, of course. So if you look at the bottom, you see architecture and engineering, life, physical, and social science, and legal, computer and mathematical as well. Those tend to have the highest median wages, but they make up smaller shares of employment in the region. Yeah, and kind of talking about which jobs are more concentrated, we use location quotients, which is basically what is the share of employment in the area I'm interested in. So in this case, in Southeast Minnesota, and how is that compared to the share of employment in the state as a whole or in the nation as a whole? This one, I believe, is compared to the state as a whole. And healthcare is about employment is about 2 times more concentrated in Southeast Minnesota than it is in the state. And so is production, about 1.3 times more concentrated in Southeast Minnesota. So probably not a surprise. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got legal jobs and computer and mathematical. Those are the least concentrated in Southeast Minnesota. Touching on cost of living, hourly wage requirements. So basically, like what it costs to cover your basic needs ranges from $9 an hour to about $31, depending on your family composition. And the highest monthly costs, probably no surprise, childcare has definitely been front of mind in a lot of chambers, economic development groups, workforce development groups as well, as one of the, especially over last year, as one of the kind of maybe previously underappreciated how big of a role it plays in the labor force and in the local economy. You unlock a lot of labor force potential when you provide accessible, affordable childcare. So a lot of parents who previously stayed at home, took care of kids, et cetera, are now free to join the workforce or rejoin the workforce. Just look at the typical cost of living. Winona is towards the lower end for the living wage for a typical family when you compare to the other counties in Southeast Minnesota. And these next 3 slides are going to take some example family composition. So this one, for example, is a single worker with no kids, their requirements to cover their basic needs. So this does not include, leisure, alcohol, tobacco, those sorts of things. This is just basic needs to cover those: housing, childcare, transportation, et cetera. And what is that wage required? And what we do is by occupational group, what is the median, the 10th, the different quintile of wages, and does the typical wages in those occupational groups cover what that family composition needs to meet their needs? So if it's highlighted, that means that you are not making enough in the typical occupational group to cover that family's basic cost needs. And you can see that as the family composition changes. So this is 2 parents, 1 full-time, 1 part-time, with 1 child. They're needing to make about $16.55 an hour to cover those needs. So more occupations and higher wage brackets for each of those occupational groups are therefore not covering those costs. And then lastly, you have a single parent with 2 children. They're needing to make about $32 an hour to cover their needs, and that kind of eliminates a lot of occupational groups. And you would have to make, the 90th percentile wage of installation, maintenance, and repair, for example, to cover this hypothetical cost for this family. So you can just see that for a single worker, especially, there's a lot of limitation as to their options to cover their basic needs. Going into some of the industry trends now. So this is just total over those 10 years, jobs fell about 873. So when you're talking about generally about 25,000 jobs, that's about 3.7%. Of course, if you were to measure that from 2010 to 2019, you would see an increase in jobs. We're comparing this to Q3, where we are still recovering and are still recovering. So I imagine that soon. Just checking. Can you still see
the out Carson a little bit?
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Am I a little bit clearer now?
Yes.
Okay. sorry about that. My connection, I think, blipped a little bit. I was just talking about how this is total jobs in Winona County. And from 2019 to 2020, there was a loss of about 7.6% of employment. It's nearly 2,000 jobs, so quite a significant loss from Q3 2019 to Q3 2020. But we will be getting Q4 numbers relatively soon. I imagine that's going to show an increase from that. Some more of the labor force trends. This is more of the industry breakdown. So it mirrors a lot of the occupational group distribution as well. Manufacturing, educational services, and healthcare and social assistance. Those combine to make up about half of all employment. And you can see the number of firms. So educational services, there's only 18 establishments there in Winona County, but they make up the second most amount of employment. So relatively large establishments. We're talking about those colleges, universities. And the highest number of firms actually is in retail trade. So you got smaller businesses in that industry. The highest quarterly payroll is manufacturing, which makes sense. It's the largest employer in the region or in the county. And the highest average annual wages is in utilities, and that's pretty common across the state as well. It's a high-paying industry, despite it being a there's only a few jobs in that industry in the county. And then the lowest average annual wages were seen in accommodation and food service, and more part-time workers in that industry, and also lower wages in general. So I promised COVID impacts. We're going to dive into that now. In the lower right is so this is for the the Rochester MSA. And you can see in the lower right, that was the employment change over the year by month. So the blue bars represent the percent change. So you could see that there's positive growth throughout all of 2019 in the Rochester MSA. Winona County is right outside of the Rochester MSA, so it's not included, but you can kind of assume that some of the same trends were present there. And then you compare that to the upper left, which is 2020. So throughout the year, down, up, down, and then of course the significant employment losses in the state and the Rochester Metro. Those losses tended to be smaller in the Rochester MSA. And then looking at the labor force itself, I talked about how the labor force was kind of the story for me. Statewide, we've lost somewhere about 4% of the labor force. In Winona County, that's been a little bit less so, which is a positive trend. And then it recovered quite a bit as well. From May to July, it increased about 5%. So there was an initial drop off that corresponded with the fall in employment and the shutdown. But you can see that pretty robust growth in the summer, followed by a little bit of a fall into the winter. But overall, from January to December, the labor force increased 0.5%, which is not that is not the case throughout the state. In fact, that's kind of bucking the trend. But that increase is less than it was in 2019, where there was almost a 2% growth in the labor force. So overall, statewide, people are dropping out of the labor force, meaning that the tight labor market that existed before, we're kind of coming back to that now as more establishments are able to open up, and they have fewer people that are applying to those jobs. There's just fewer people looking for work than there were last year or the year before. And then employment, of course, you could see the big drop into April and May. But then there's a faster rise May to July compared to 2019. Of course, there was probably just more of a steady employment growth there in 2019. And then from January to December of 2020, there was an increase of 38. So actually added employment in Winona County, but did not add it at the same rate as we saw in 2019, which was about 645 jobs. But overall, Winona County has come out of it faring much better than a lot of other counties throughout the state. So far, that is. And then from March to May, this is the unemployment trends. We saw, of course, just as there was a big decrease in employment, there was a big increase in unemployed. And from May to December, we saw that decline pretty consistently, down 1,000 after growing about 1,200. So from January to December 2020, there was a gain of about 11.5%. Meanwhile, in 2019, there was about a loss of 11%. So we talk about kind of the seasonality and the timing. This happened, the big decline in employment last year happened right when typically a lot of places are doing kind of seasonal hiring. A lot of leisure and hospitality industries tended to be hiring up. Construction was not impacted as much as other industries in the pandemic. However, they did not hire as much. They didn't grow as much as they typically do from Q1 to Q2. And then unemployment rate showed the same trend as we saw in the unemployed. So this is just to show you again the difference between 2019 and 2020. The labor force declined slightly. Employment was down 2.5%. We talked about the Southeast Minnesota is down like 7.6%. That's kind of in line with the state. And unemployment grew quite a bit and kind of ended the year still up about half as much as it was in 2019. And the unemployment rate is also, quite a bit higher as a result. Talk about the impact on industries. So this is from Winona County specifically again, and this is from our QCEW data, which is our, I would say, most robust data. It lags a little bit just because it takes a while to collect all the information, but it's definitely the most accurate source that we have. And it shows how from Q1 to Q2, that's when we capture that big employment loss, lost about 2,500 jobs or about 10.6% from Q1 to Q2. That compares to a typical kind of growth of 1.3%. So that 10.6% doesn't capture the full impacts when typically we're seeing 1 to 2% growth. Kind of add those together and you're getting the 13% difference from what we typically see in employment change. And then Q2 to Q3, we saw significant growth, of course, as we're starting to recover a lot of those jobs that were lost. And then by industry, you can see the differing impacts. Manufacturing was one that was saw a pretty significant loss of employment. However, accommodation, food services, arts, entertainment, and recreation, and other services had the largest percent declines from Q1 to Q2. Almost 44% for those leisure and hospitality industries, a loss of employment. They gained back a significant amount, but accommodation, food services, they lost about 960. They only gained back through Q3 about 485 of those. So incomplete recovery. The same thing for manufacturing, lost about 550. Only slightly over 200 had returned by the end of Q3. So from Q2 to Q3, 14 of 16 sectors saw gains, which is definitely positive. And that educational services decline from Q2 to Q3, that may have to do more with just the end of the school year as well. We typically see declines in educational services, so that doesn't necessarily reflect COVID impacts. Although, of course, educational services was a sector that is significantly impacted by the impacts of the pandemic. Christy, I just want to do a time check real quick. I've got a few slides left. I want to make sure I'm not running over my time.
You're good. We're at 8:43, so you're doing okay.
Okay, cool. This is a little more on the industry impact by county. So how do you compare to neighboring counties? You can see that Winona County is, it's a little bit larger from loss initially Q1 to Q2, but also saw a little bit about average bounce back from Q2 to Q3. So only Goodhue had a larger percent decline from Q1 to Q2, and they bounced back, 10% Q2 to Q3, whereas Winona had that 10% loss, but only a 5.7% recovery. So kind of mixed results, I would say, compared to some of the regional neighbors. Unemployment claims was one of the data sources that we kind of relied on a little bit more last year, just as it was one that we were able to provide on a weekly basis updates on, whereas a lot of our other data, we have to wait a while for them to be updated and published. But unemployment was one that we used and kind of leaned on to show, what is actually happening in closer real time. We were able to track unemployment claims, by region, by county, by a lot of those demographic attributes, but also by occupation and industry. So we were able to have pretty good data on who was filing unemployment claims. At the beginning of the year, we also tracked applications. So that was more relevant right when the pandemic started, because then it showed the initial impact, like how many people are applying for unemployment. It's kind of an indication of, who hasn't been on unemployment before that and who is now, impacted by this event. And in the region, we saw over 100,000 unemployment insurance applications. That was equivalent to about 36% of the labor force. So pretty significant impacts. About over a third of workers were filing or trying to file a claim at some point. The highest number was in Olmsted, kind of no surprise there, with Rochester, and the highest percentage of the labor force that applied for unemployment claims was in Dodge County. So I'll just note that applications don't necessarily mean that those folks were receiving unemployment insurance benefits. And it also does not mean that they are fully unemployed. They could also have had their hours cut and just been applying for kind of that difference between full time and what they were working. But nonetheless, it does kind of show the magnitude of the impact last year. A little more into those. So this is unemployment claims. So these are folks that applied, were accepted, and then we're filing claims every week or bi-week. So starting in January of 2020, the peak was actually in April. Basically a year ago today was the peak of unemployment claims in Winona County. And that peak was about 2,900. So you compare that to, how many workers or how many jobs, that was about, 13, 14% of all the jobs in Winona County. So pretty significant number of folks. And that was quite a big increase, almost 5 times what it was before the pandemic. And then since then, or at least through February this year, it's declined quite a bit. We're back down to 600, which is 150 more than what it was pre-pandemic, but good trends that were declining and continue to do so. This is, I mentioned, occupational group. So we measured unemployment claims by occupational group as well. Just when you look at the table on the right, there's the column start to peak. So basically, what was it pre-pandemic and what was that change? So some pretty ridiculous increases, particularly if you look at the top healthcare practitioners and technical. There was only 28 people or 28 workers from that occupational group that were filing claims before the pandemic. And then at the peak, almost 3,300 were. So healthcare, which we typically thought of as a kind of a recession-proof industry or occupational group, was also impacted during the pandemic. So it just kind of shows the unique impacts that the pandemic had across industries and occupations. Personal care and service is another one, and healthcare support kind of goes along with healthcare practitioners and technical. And then food preparation and serving related, again, those are those largely leisure and hospitality supporting occupations. I mentioned construction at the other end. You can see that not at a relatively large increase in terms of unemployment claims, but still about a 40% increase. And the impacts were spread and felt across all occupational groups. I mentioned by demographic. We also have information by race and ethnicity. The increase for white workers, about 5 times. But when you compare that to workers of color, you can see that there's some evident disparities. Black or African American workers, 13 times the number of claims are being filed. And then Asian workers as well, very, very high numbers relative to their share of the workforce. And those disparities are still there. While there's been declines in each of these groups, those declines have not made up for how large that gap that was opened up. And this is showing a long-term risk of unemployment. One of my colleagues put together this tool, which kind of takes a lot of the information we've shown in the last couple slides and then applies it to kind of determine who was most at risk to be unemployed for longer. We look at the columns. You can see that the percent of people who were ever separated are permanently separated. So that's the share of claimants. So people filing claims since March 2020 that did not expect to go back to where they were working before. So permanently separated. And then percent of those continued filing, that's the green column. Those are the folks who continue to file after October 3rd. So that's more of an indication of like longer term unemployment. And what we see is that, again, Black or African-American workers, they're much more likely to be unemployed or filing unemployment claims, almost twice as likely. And they're also more likely to be permanently separated. And their average number of weeks on UI was also greater than other workers. Female workers were more likely to be filing claims, which is typically not the case. It's usually men are much more likely to be filing claims. But so that shows kind of the inordinate impacts on women workers last year as well. And then when you go by age, the youngest workers are most likely to be more likely to be unemployed or filing unemployment claims, but the oldest workers were more likely to be unemployed for longer. So maybe tougher on them to find new work in different occupations, or maybe more hesitancy due to fear of COVID and its spread as well. This is looking at kind of how those recessions line up against each other. So how the employment change compared to the last 2 previous downturns. So the light blue line is the Great Recession. The orange line represents the pandemic recession last year. And that gray line is kind of the 2001, 2004-ish downturn. So it just really is, I put this tool together to show the magnitude of the decline and how that compared to kind of more general declines for the 2 previous recessions. So this is over the year employment change. And you can see almost overnight from 1 month to the next, we had a decline of about 11%. Whereas the peak of the Great Recession, or the trough, if you will, was only about 3.4% in the Rochester MSA. So when you compare them, it just is very striking, and we still have not reached the point of the worst over the year decline of the Great Recession. We're still trying to recover to reach that point. So I'll wrap up here. A lot of themes, but the main ones that I want to touch on is that despite there being high unemployment currently, we still have what I would describe as a tight labor market. A lot of those folks that are unemployed are still going to be hesitant to return to work as we're waiting for more confidence in public health, more of the immunizations. That said, there are a lot of openings still. A lot of employers are still trying to hire. So you're going to see a lot of that tension there, and you're going to see a lot of, I would predict a lot of continued difficulty for employers trying to find workers. Employers are also increasing wages and additional perks to try and lure more of those workers back. But I think that the kind of the overarching concern of the pandemic will kind of dominate the narrative, at least for the short term. Many employers are also working with high schoolers and colleges, career pathways. I mentioned those 15 to 24-year-olds and how there's a large portion of them in Winona County, trying to capture those sources of future workforce. And home and school and childcare issues as another components that also are informing people's decisions on whether to return to work or not. And employers at the same time, it seems counterintuitive, but employers are also experiencing ghosting. So they may get to a point where they think they have a hire and they just don't hear back. And it's very strange to kind of hear from both job seekers and employers the differing frustrations. So I think it just belies the fact that it's a very complicated labor force right now, and it's going to remain uncertain for the time being. And we're hoping that the labor force grows in the next couple months as confidence returns. But yeah, uncertainty still remains, to be sure. So I'm happy to take some questions now if there are any. And thank you for your time.
I stopped sharing your screen. If you want to ask a question, certainly unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. And I'm sure Carson would be happy to answer that, or you can shoot something in the chat too.
Well, this is Jim Dakota. I've got a question in regards to the COVID situation. Do you see from birth records and things like that a baby boom as people were staying at home and needing to find something to do? Something similar to what happened after World War II, when the guys came back from the war and all of a sudden, our generation, the baby boom generation, was born. Are there any statistics to map out that we might be getting a large increase in our labor force in the next 18 years?
That's a great question, and not one I've gotten actually. And if you had asked it like a minute earlier, I would have asked my partner, who's an OBGYN locally, to ask her for some like firsthand knowledge as to whether she's seeing an increase in births at the hospital. But I have not heard that they're seeing data of such an increase. I would have to look into that, and I'll touch with Mark, and we'll get back to you if that works, because I'm not sure off the top of my head if there has been such an increase.
Thank you.
Yep.
This is Larry Lundblad. You kind of partially answered my question on the last slide, but you talked earlier about folks dropping out of the workforce, and maybe I was late joining. Maybe you already touched on this, but when that phrase is used, and I hear it in the media as well, where are these folks going? Are they retiring? Are they, relying on government, supports at this point, and have no intention of coming back? Can you describe that cohort a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. So it's kind of all above. You touched on some of the major components of that, of those people. So retirees is definitely a significant portion. I think another portion that we've been talking about more is folks that are dropping out to caretake. So most of that is for family members. So mothers that were previously in the workforce and had to drop out last year for their schools were closed, their childcare was closed, so there wasn't an option there. That is definitely more common last year than it has been in the past. And then I think there probably is some component of people who are not looking for work right now because again of the pandemic itself. So just scared to be exposed or go back. And yeah, I think that the benefits play a role in that. I think that some folks say that there's an unintended consequence that people were not, going to work as part of the increased generosity of the unemployment benefits. And I've looked at a ton of research. There is no significant association between those two, the increased unemployment benefits and decreased employment. That said, I think there are cases where that is true, and it does impact it, but I don't think it's the primary driver. I think that there are multiple drivers that are keeping people out or keeping people from looking for work. And I think that the benefits are just one piece of that. So you kind of answered your own question when you listed all the people there, but I do think that there are larger, it's just kind of an acceleration of those groups, especially those that are taking care of the family members.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
A couple comments that entered into the chat, Carson, for your information. Mike Dieter from Express Employment said that he just read an article the other day that more and more couples are actually having a child on hold while the pandemic is going on. They're estimating a 500,000 shortage in births in the U.S. this year. Another person commented, I believe, that the same thing happened after 9/11. Her son was born in September 2002, and his class in school is much smaller than classes before him.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, I believe that for sure. I think so you could make the argument like, oh, we're all cooped up with our family members and loved ones, and therefore there'll be a baby boom, but we're also cooped up with our family members and loved ones, so maybe there won't be a baby boom for the same reason.
Any other questions?
And I'll just say, yeah, thank you again for having me on and putting up with my Duluth MSA comments. But if you do have any questions that you think of, don't hesitate to reach out to me or Mark, and we'll definitely follow up and answer anything that you come up with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Carson. Again, being the market analyst for the Northeast Minnesota, it makes absolute sense that you would reference Duluth over Rochester. We appreciate the time and the information. I did record this. Carson, if you could email me the slides, we will share those with those that participated and make sure that we get the recording out as well.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.